Did I do it? Okay, I must have. Okay, there we go. We're good. Alright, I'm just going to assume that everything's working. Alright, today we're going through the system's neatest trick as narrated by this guy, written by everyone's favorite uncle, Ted K. I'm just doing commentary for this for myself. Alright, let's begin.
Let's begin by making clear what the system is not. The system is not George W. Bush and his advisors and appointees. It is not the cops who maltreat protesters. It is not the CEOs of the multinational corporations. And it is not the Frankensteins in their laboratories who criminally tinker with the genes of living things.
There's a little bit of a predictive power right there. I can't remember. I think this was originally written in 2003. So, a bit of foresight from Uncle Ted.
These people are servants of the system, but in themselves do not constitute the system. In particular, the personal and individual values, attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of any of these people may be significantly in conflict with the needs of the system. To illustrate with an example, the system requires respect for property rights, yet CEOs, cops, scientists, and politicians sometimes steal. In speaking of stealing, we don't have to confine ourselves to actual lifting of physical objects. We can include all legal means of acquiring property, such as cheating on income tax, accepting bribes, and any other form of graft or corruption. But the fact that CEOs, cops, scientists, and politicians sometimes steal does not mean that stealing is part of the system. On the contrary, when a cop or a politician steals something, he is rebelling against the system's requirement of respect for law and property. Yet, even when they are stealing, these people remain servants of the system as long as they publicly maintain their support for law and property. Whatever illegal acts may be committed by politicians...
So I think that's an interesting point, because it's always, especially when you hear leftists talk, they're always talking about that's one of their primary motivations for wanting to tear down the system, is because they want to stop the corruption, and thinking that corruption is built into the system itself. Ted's going to explain further on why that's not the case, but I just want you to keep that in mind as we're watching this.
Cops or CEOs as individuals, theft, bribery, and graft are not part of the system, but diseases of the system. The less stealing there is, the better the system functions, and that is why the servants and boosters of the system always advocate obedience to the law in public, even if they may sometimes find it convenient to break the law in private. Take another example. Although the police are the system's enforcers, police brutality is not part of the system. When the cops beat the crap out of a suspect, they are not doing the system's work. They are only letting out their own anger and hostility. The system's goal is not brutality or the expression of anger. As far as police work is concerned, the system's goal is to compel obedience to its rules and to do so with the least possible amount of disruption, violence, and bad publicity. Thus, from the system's point of view, the ideal cop is one who never gets angry, never uses any more violence than necessary, and as far as possible relies on manipulation rather than force to keep people under control.
Yeah, because this is... what ends up happening there is that the system's trying to maintain its moral monopoly on violence, but in the grand scheme of things, if it could, it would try to create a complete abolition on even the thought of violence. I'm almost done reading Camp of the Saints, and in that book they state essentially Europe is completely being overrun by third worlders in this fictional work, and it's argued that in the grand scheme of things, Europe is a minority in the grand scheme of things, and that when a minority is pressed, violence is its only repercussion that it can take against an overwhelming mob, and that basically the system's trying to keep violence from ever becoming a possible option, from ever being recognized. I'll continue.
police brutality is only another disease of the system, not part of the system. For proof, look at the attitude of the media. The mainstream media almost universally condemn police brutality. Of course, the attitude of the mainstream media represents, as a rule, the consensus of opinion among the powerful classes in our society as to what is good for the system. What has just been said about theft, graft, and police brutality applies also to issues of discrimination and victimization, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty, and sweatshops. All of these are bad for the system. For example, the more that black people feel themselves scorned or excluded, the more likely they are to turn to crime, and the less likely they are to...
So, just because I don't think he really goes into this that far, this goes back to what he was talking about. It's like these things don't serve the system, because essentially what is trying to happen here is the system wants all unchosen bonds to be broken down. It wants to be the ultimate solvent to destroy unchosen bonds for the sake of turning people into interchangeable widgets that serve this ultimately demonic machine that is the system, as we call it.
Educate themselves for careers that will make them useful to the system. Modern technology, with its rapid long-distance transportation and its disruption of traditional ways of life, has led to the mixing of populations, so that nowadays people of different races, nationalities, cultures, and religions have to live and work side by side. If people hate or reject one another on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual preference, etc., the resulting conflicts interfere with the functioning of the system. Apart from a few old fossilized relics of the past like Jesse Helms, the leaders of the system know this very well, and that is why we are taught in school and through the media to believe that racism, sexism, homophobia, and so forth are social evils to be eliminated. No doubt some of the leaders of the system, some of the politicians, scientists, and CEOs privately feel that a woman's place is in the home, or that homosexuality and interracial marriage are repugnant. But even if the majority of them felt this way, it would not mean that racism, sexism, and homophobia were part of the system, any more than the existence of stealing among the leaders means that stealing is part of the system. Just as the system must promote respect for law and property for the sake of its own security.
Let's slow that down. So again, and this is again reinforcing that idea of that these things that are being pointed out these things are naturally human things, and that trying to reduce them is to reduce what it means to be a human being.
The system must also discourage racism and other forms of victimization for the same reason. That is why the system, notwithstanding any private deviations by individual members of the elite, is basically committed to suppressing discrimination and victimization. For proof, look again at the attitude of the mainstream media. In spite of occasional timid dissent by a few of the more daring and reactionary commentators, media propaganda overwhelmingly favours racial and gender equality and acceptance of homosexuality and interracial marriage. The system needs a population that is meek, non-violent, domesticated, docile, and obedient. It needs to avoid any conflict or disruption that could interfere with the orderly functioning of the social machine. In addition to suppressing racial, ethnic, religious, and other group hostilities, it also has to suppress or harness for its own advantage all other tendencies that could lead to disruption or disorder, such as machismo, aggressive impulses, and any inclination toward violence. Naturally, traditional racial and ethnic antagonisms die slowly. Machismo, aggressiveness, and violent impulses are not easily suppressed, and attitudes towards sex and gender identity are not transformed overnight. Therefore, there are many individuals who resist these changes, and the system is faced with the problem of overcoming their resistance. All of us in modern society are hemmed in by a dense network of rules and regulations. We are at the mercy of large organizations such as corporations, governments, labor unions, universities, churches, and political parties, and consequently, we are powerless. As a result of the servitude, the powerlessness, and the other indignities that the system inflicts on us, there is widespread frustration, which leads to an impulse to rebel. And this is where the system plays its neatest trick. For a brilliant sleight of hand, it turns rebellion to its own advantage.
This is the important part.
Many people do not understand the roots of their own frustration, hence their rebellion is directionless. They know that they want to rebel, but they don't know what they want to rebel against.
So, this is where I want to kind of take in and input my own commentary into the very real historical events in the last 5 years. An example of that here in Canada would be the truckers protests in Ottawa. Essentially, that those people's, this is dipping a bit into elite theory, but a bunch of guys showed up, and here we are 2-3 years later, and nothing ever came of it. Like, does anybody ever talk about, was any actual identity that came out of that situation? Like, was there ever any change? Other than getting Aaron O'Toole out of office, not really. And then he just ended up being replaced by a cleaner guy, Pierre Poilievre, who gets to basically run, the new liberal containment cap for the for the Canadian right wing, so that, basically white people don't get too fucking angry and feel like their voice is actually being heard.
Luckily, the system is able to fill their need by providing them with a list of standard and stereotyped
Ding, ding, ding.
grievances in the name of which to rebel. Racism,
What does that sound like?
homophobia,
That sounds like
women's
every political
issues,
party in
poverty,
Canada.
sweatshops, the whole laundry bag of activist issues. Huge numbers of would-be rebels take the bait. In fighting racism, sexism, etc., etc.,
Exploitation,
they are only doing the system's work
colonialism,
for
yada
it.
yada yada. Take your
In
pick.
spite of this, they imagine that they are rebelling against the system. How is this possible? First, 50 years ago, the system was not yet committed to equality for black people, women, and homosexuals, so that action in favour of these causes really was a form of rebellion. Consequently, these causes came to be conventionally regarded as rebel.
And this is one of the things, and why I fucking hate the quote from Francis Fukuyama in 1989 when they said that it was the end of history. It's like, it's very clearly not the end of history, because a lot of these groups occupy, like, they still exist within time. Like, these groups, a lot of people want to pretend, and even on the right, that like the progressive narrative, the progressives have captured the idea of the future, and that everything is always moving leftward. This is a perfect example of how it doesn't, and how if people had been paying attention, if people had been actually not, like, I guess people had been demoralized at this point. This is why this was allowed to go the way it did. But it's not like this couldn't have been cut off in the past with proper foresight. Now, that being said, I think the people of the past never saw anything like this. Like, what was the last thing that would have even been remotely like this? And fucking everybody brings it up. But probably the fall of the Roman Empire, when we start seeing that level of degeneracy. And if you're a toothless hick, again, as that makes up most of Canada's rural population, when, a bunch of, Coors drinking, Saturday night hockey watching, redneck, you're probably not going to be too interested in, like, grand politique, as the French would say. And you're not, like, a lot of people there was no pushback in the past for them to get involved in this shit, just because it was, I think it was a quote from, I don't know, it was one of the the MGTOW guys, I think his name was Aaron Clary, who had said, like, Canada is life on easy mode. And for the most part, it is. Even today, I still think it is, because there has never been a point in Canadian history ever since, like, the colonization of this country where the Anglo population has had to look and be like really cement its identity. Like, the last time we really had to do that was when we were fighting the Indians. Anyway, sorry, I got sidetracked there. Let's continue.
Causes. They have retained that status today simply as a matter of tradition. That is, because each rebel generation imitates the preceding generations. Second, there are still significant numbers of people, as I pointed out earlier, who resist the social changes that the system requires. and some of these people even are authority figures such as cops, judges, or politicians. These resistors provide a target for the would-be rebels, someone for them to rebel against. Commentators like Rush Limbaugh help the process by ranting against the activists. Seeing that they have made someone angry fosters the activists' illusion that they are rebelling. Third, in order to bring themselves into conflict even with the majority of the system's leaders who fully accept...
And I know this is predominantly audio-based. Like, I'm making this for someone who's basically in the same demographic category as I am, who's not going to be watching the audio version, but if you'd seen the background kind of fluff, there was a bunch of conservative commentators there, like Steven Crowder, about how essentially these guys basically act like a wave break in the grand scheme of things, so that people never go too far. You are rebelling far enough, is to say.
The social changes that the system demands, the would-be rebels insist on solutions that go farther than what the system's leaders consider prudent, and they show exaggerated anger over trivial matters. For example, they demand payment of reparations to black people, and they often become enraged at any criticism of a minority group, no matter how cautious and reasonable. In this way, the activists are able to maintain the illusion that they are rebelling against the system, but the illusion is absurd. Agitation against racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like no more constitutes rebellion against the system than does agitation against political graft and corruption. Those who work against graft and corruption are not rebelling, but acting as the system's enforcers. They are helping to keep the politicians obedient to the rules of the system. Those who work against racism, sexism, and homophobia, similarly, are acting as the system's enforcers. They help the system to suppress the deviant racist, sexist, and homophobic attitudes that cause problems for the system. But the activists don't only act as the system's enforcers. They also serve as a kind of lightning rod that protects the system by drawing public resentment away from the system and its institutions. For example, there were several reasons why it was to the system's advantage to get women out of the home and into the workplace. 50 years ago, if the system, as represented by the government or the media, had begun, out of the blue, a propaganda campaign designed to make it socially acceptable for women to center their lives on careers rather than on the home, the natural human resistance to change would have caused widespread public resentment. What actually happened was that the changes were spearheaded by radical feminists, behind whom the system's institutions trailed at a safe distance. The resentment of the more conservative members of society was directed primarily against the radical feminists rather than against the system and its institutions. Because the changes sponsored by the system seemed slow and moderate in comparison with the more radical solutions advocated by feminists. And even these relatively slow changes were seen as having been forced on the system by pressure from the radicals. So, in a nutshell, the system's neatest trick is this. 1. For the sake of its own efficiency and security, the system needs to bring about deep and radical social changes to match the changed conditions resulting from technological progress. 2. The frustration of life under the circumstances imposed by the system leads...
Sorry, just while it's on my mind, so this is my big criticism of Kaczynski, he doesn't touch on this in the System's Neatest Trick. He talks about it in the Industrial Society and its Consequences. But that technological society is something that has to be fought against. I don't think this is true. I think that technological society is something that it's a natural drive that exists within humanity, or at least Western Europeans it does. Anything with like the natural consequence of the Faustian spirit. Like that just exists within Western man, and that there's always going to be something within us that's technophilic. And there's two hurdles that we need to overcome here, which is the one that is being talked about in this book, which is basically re-wrangling the what I'd call the Promethean drive and subjugating it for the Commonwealth. That's Kaczynski, and this is like the whole purpose of I almost want to say revolt against the modern world, but no, technical society, its consequences, is that it needs to be stamped out. I don't think this is possible. This isn't a genie you can put back in the bottle. I guess the reason why I brought up Revolt Against the Modern World, because I was thinking of Evola, and not that book, but Ride the Tiger in particular, which is that you need to figure out how to hop on the top of the beast and ride it into submission. And then obviously the second point that leads into this is like, how do you do such a thing? And I think that has to do with a profound change in morality, is the how we conceptualize ourselves as people. It's no secret that things like Christianity are basically like kind of dead in the water, and that there needs to be a change in Western spirituality that is entangled with the technological process, and it needs to be conscious of such things, because it's currently not. Anyways,
leads to rebellious impulses. 3. Rebellious impulses are co-opted by the system in the service of the social changes it requires. Activists rebel against the old and outmoded values that are no longer of use to the system, and in favour of the new values that the system needs us to accept. 4. In this way, rebellious impulses, which might otherwise have been dangerous to the system, are given an outlet that is not only harmless to the system, but useful to it. 5. Much of the public resentment resulting from the imposition of social changes is drawn away from the system and its institutions, and is directed instead at the radicals who spearhead the social changes. Of course, this trick was not planned in advance by the system's leaders, who are not conscious of having played a trick at all. The way it works is something like this. In deciding what position to take on any issue, the editors, publishers, and owners of the media must consciously or unconsciously balance several factors. They must consider how their readers or viewers will react to what they print or broadcast about the issue. They must consider how their advertisers, their peers in the media, and other powerful persons will react. And they must consider the effect on the security of the system of what they print or broadcast. These practical considerations will usually outweigh whatever personal feelings they might have about the issue. The personal feelings of the media leaders, their advertisers, and other powerful persons are varied. They may be liberal or conservative, religious or atheistic. The only universal common ground among the leaders is their commitment to the system, its security, and its power. Therefore, within the limits imposed by what the public is willing to accept, the principal factor determining the attitudes propagated by the media is a rough consensus of opinion among the media leaders and other powerful people as to what is good for the system. Thus, when an editor or other media leader sets out to decide what attitude to take toward a movement or cause, his first thought is whether the movement includes anything that is good or bad for the system. Maybe he tells himself that his decision is based on moral, philosophical, or religious grounds. But it is an observable fact that in practice the security of the system takes precedence over all other factors in determining the attitude of the media. For example, if a news magazine editor looks at the militia movement, he may or may not sympathise personally with some of its grievances and goals. But he also sees that there will be a strong consensus among his advertisers and his peers in the media that the militia movement is potentially dangerous to the system and therefore should be discouraged. Under these circumstances, he knows that his magazine had better take a negative attitude toward the militia movement. The negative attitude of the media presumably is part of the reason why the militia movement has died down. When the same editor looks at radical feminism, he sees that some of its more extreme solutions would be dangerous to the system. But he also sees that feminism holds much that is useful to the system. Women's participation in the business and technical world integrates them and their families.
It's kind of, again, unrelated, but just kind of contrasting those two examples against one another. So, this is more of a function of warfare, and the militia movement in its case is ultimately a direct form of warfare, and radical feminism is an indirect kind of warfare. It is a psyop. It is designed to do the same thing that every conservative commentator has been talking about since 2014, and say that it's meant to take fertile young women and make them work their most fertile years away at some fucking corporate job until they're actually able to settle down in their 30s, where they only end up having, 0 to 2 kids at most. The system cannot take direct conflict. All of its conflict is indirect. It's not that there isn't any conflict. It's that the tools at its discretion. In Machiavellian ethics, we would view this as total domination by a political class by foxes rather than lions. Foxes use indirect power to look for snares. Lions do direct power to get what they want.
Better into the system. Their talents are of service to the system in business and technical matters. Feminist emphasis on ending domestic abuse and rape also serves the system's needs, since rape and abuse...
I want to point that out again. One thing I've noticed, and it's a really touchy subject, I'll use this as an example, is when people talk about sexual assault on women, they bring up, like, date rape. And how, I don't want to even say victims, but the class of people who is susceptible to getting date raped will do this kind of, like, weird, matter-of-fact, like, oh, I bet you didn't even know that sexual assault was that common, did you? And it's like, they'll try to pose that as a, like, oh, I'm here for a bad person because I'm unaware. But they direct that anger towards the person who might actually be able to assist them, right? Because this is one thing I was talking about my wife about, like, where would you even find roofies? Like, I don't even know where I would find such a thing. I've never even been in a situation where a guy thought that was cool to even bring up. Like, oh, dude, check. I've had guys bring up weed in front of me. I've had guys bring up MDMA in front of me. Like, bring up things that are like, oh, dude, look what I got. Isn't that cool? But I've never had a guy, like, pull out a bag of roofies at one point and be like, hey, dude, guess what I'm doing later tonight? Like, so it's really, like, these two warring castes where, like, victimization, and this is another function of indirect conflict within the system, is, like, people who have been, I hate saying that because it's leftist coded, but I don't have a better way of announcing this. People who have been victimized will then turn around and blame and shame the people who possibly would even prevent these things from happening post the fact. I don't know, that's just like the most stark example I can give off the top of my head.
Like other forms of violence, are dangerous to the system. Perhaps most important, the editor recognises that the pettiness and meaninglessness of modern housework and the social isolation of the modern housewife can lead to serious frustration for many women. Frustration that will cause problems for the system unless women are allowed an outlet through careers in the business and technical world. Even if this editor is a macho type who personally feels more comfortable with women in a subordinate position, he knows that feminism, at least in a relatively moderate form, is good for the system. He knows that his editorial posture must be favourable toward moderate feminism, otherwise he will face the disapproval of his advertisers and other powerful people. This is why the mainstream media's attitude has been generally supportive of moderate feminism, mixed toward radical feminism, and consistently hostile only toward the most extreme feminist positions. Through this type of process, rebel movements that are dangerous to the system are subjected to negative propaganda, while rebel movements that are believed to be useful to the system are given cautious encouragement in the media. Unconscious absorption of media propaganda influences would-be rebels to rebel in ways that serve the interests of the system. The university intellectuals also play an important role in carrying out the system's trick. Though they like to fancy themselves independent thinkers, the intellectuals are, allowing for individual exceptions, the most over-socialized the most conformist, the tamest and most domesticated, the most pampered, dependent, and spineless group in America today. As a result, their impulse to rebel is particularly strong, but because they are incapable of independent thought, real rebellion is impossible for them. Consequently, they are suckers for the system's trick, which allows them to irritate people and enjoy the illusion of rebelling without ever having to challenge the system's basic values. Because they are the teachers of young people, the university intellectuals are in a position to help the system play its trick on the young, which they do by steering young people's rebellious impulses toward the standard, stereotyped targets: racism, colonialism, women's issues, etc. Young people who are not college
Anything that can be
students learn
described
through the
as
media
ambition.
or through personal contact of the social justice issues for which students rebel, and they imitate the students. Thus, our youth culture develops in which there is a stereotyped mode of rebellion that spreads through imitation of peers, just as hairstyles, clothing styles, and other fads spread through imitation. Naturally, the system's trick does not work perfectly. Not all of the positions
No, it
adopted
doesn't,
by
because
the
if it did, I
activist
wouldn't be talking right now.
community are consistent with the needs of the system. In this connection, some of the most important difficulties that confront the system are related to the conflict between the two different types of propaganda that the system has to use: integration propaganda and agitation propaganda. Integration propaganda is the principal mechanism of socialization in modern society. It is propaganda that is designed to instill in people the attitudes, beliefs, values, and habits that they need to have in order to be safe and useful tools of the system. It teaches people to permanently repress or sublimate those emotional impulses that are dangerous to the system. Its focus is on long-term attitudes and deep-seated values of broad applicability, rather than on attitudes towards specific current issues.
Well, so I would like to counter that and say, especially within recent history, is the problem is especially our politicians become more and more like inept at knowing how to play the game, like the realpolitik, and they just become more and more shoehorned. And obviously, like I said, if the system, and this is the point of this section of the essay, but like if it were perfect, I wouldn't be talking, right? I would be caught up in the mass of things. Like I wouldn't feel the need to talk to an audience of 0 people, but the fact that I'm doing this proves that there is a flaw.
Issues. Agitation propaganda plays on people's emotions so as to bring out certain attitudes or behaviors in specific, current situations. Instead of teaching people to suppress dangerous emotional impulses, it seeks to stimulate certain emotions for well-defined purposes localized in time. The system needs an orderly, docile, cooperative, passive, dependent population. Above all, it requires a non-violent population, since it needs the government to have a monopoly on the use of physical force. For this reason, integration propaganda has to teach us to be horrified, frightened, and appalled by violence, so that we will not be tempted to use it even when we are very angry. By violence, I mean physical attacks on human beings. More generally, integration propaganda has to teach us soft, cuddly values that emphasize non-aggressiveness, interdependence, and cooperation. On the other hand, in certain contexts, the system itself finds it useful or necessary to resort to brutal, aggressive methods to achieve its own objectives. The most obvious example of such methods is warfare. In wartime, the system relies on agitation propaganda in order to win public approval of military action. It plays on people's emotions to make them feel frightened and angry at their real or supposed...
I gotta just go on a tangent whenever we go on this. Is how do the elites expect to rally especially young men, to fight for a Western country these days? Like, it doesn't, like, you have to be fucking straight, and I know it's played out saying this, but, like, you have to be retarded to want to go and fight in the military these days. Like, you have to literally have your fucking head in the sand. Like, I can drive 2 hours in a certain direction, and I'm basically in a different country, and that country isn't predominantly European. It's normally some sort of Middle Eastern. and I'm supposed to be occupying the same land as a people that's fucking totally different than me. Why the fuck would I fight for my own ethnic replacement? Like, this is a real fucking jam that our elites have got themselves into, to where they're no longer able to even, like, make a case. Like, they better be praying to God every morning that they wake up that heavy weather never comes, that this kind of fair weather that we're in, this eternal summer, stays around. Because if winter, no, I'm not gonna say if, when winter does come, it's gonna be a fucking dump. It's gonna be a hell on earth when winter comes.
The enemy. In this situation, there is a conflict between integration propaganda and agitation propaganda. Those people in whom cuddly values and the aversion to violence have been most deeply planted can't be easily persuaded to approve a bloody military operation. Here the system's trick backfires to some extent. The activists, who have been rebelling all along in favour of the values of integration propaganda, continue to do so during wartime. They oppose the war effort not only because it...
Yeah, this is the golem, as we've seen in the last year, like in Harvard Yard, for example. The the leftist golem who end up turning around and fighting for Palestine is, you know, the most prescient example, if anyone's paying attention.
It is violent, but because it is racist, colonialist, imperialist, etc. All of which are contrary to the soft, cuddly values taught by integration propaganda. The system's trick also backfires where the treatment of animals is concerned. Inevitably, many people extend to animals the soft values and the aversion to violence that they are taught with respect to humans. They are horrified by the slaughter of animals for meat, and by other practices harmful to animals, such as the reduction of chickens to egg-laying machines kept in tiny cages.
Listen, I do have to agree with that. Fucking, those things aren't particularly nice. Despite the fact I'm not vegan now, I am slowly making the transition. In an ideal world, in a perfect world, I'm not vegan, but all the meat I do eat is procured either by me or somebody within my local sphere. I would, if I had a magic wand, I would absolutely remove mass factory farming from this mortal plane, but I don't, so I choose to ignore it.
Or the use of animals in scientific experiments. Up to a point, the resulting opposition to mistreatment of animals may be useful to the system, because a vegan diet is more efficient in terms of resource utilization than a carnivorous one is. Veganism, if widely adopted, will help to ease the burden placed on the Earth's limited resources by the growth of the human population.
More heavy metals in your body.
But activists' insistence on ending the use of animals in scientific experiments is squarely in conflict with the system's needs, since for the foreseeable future there is not likely to be any workable substitute for living animals as research subjects. All the same, the fact that the system's trick does backfire here and there does not prevent it from being, on the whole, a remarkably effective device for turning rebellious impulses to the system's advantage. It has to be conceded that the trick described here is not the only factor determining the direction that rebellious impulses take in our society. Many people today feel weak and powerless, for the very good reason that the system really does make us weak and powerless, and therefore identify obsessively with victims, with the weak and the oppressed. That's part of the reason why victimization issues such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and neo-colonialism have become standard activist issues. I have with me an anthropology textbook in which I've noticed several nice examples of the way in which university intellectuals help the system with its trick by disguising conformity as a criticism of modern society. The cutest of these examples is found on page 132 to 36, where the author quotes, in adapted form, an article by one Rhonda K. Williamson, an intersexed person, that is, a person born with both male and female characteristics. Williamson states that the American Indians not only accepted intersex persons, but especially valued them. She contrasts this attitude with the Euro-American attitude, which she equates with the attitude that her own parents adopted toward her. Williamson's parents mistreated her cruelly. They held her in contempt for her intersex condition. They told her she was cursed and given over to the devil, and they took her to charismatic churches to have the demon cast out of her. She was even given napkins in which she was supposed to cough out the demon. But it is obviously ridiculous to equate this with the modern Euro-American attitude.
Yeah, like if
it may
you were to bring
approximate the
this up,
Euro-American...
like, this is a common thing that I often think is like, I am the most right-wing person I know. If this was brought up to my local pastor, or probably anybody in my church, they would all be fucking horrified to hear this.
Attitude of 150 years ago. But nowadays, almost any American educator, psychologist, or mainstream clergyman would be horrified at that.
She was a part of a weird fucking subgroup of people which no longer exists in polite society, especially in 2024.
Kind of treatment of an intersexed person. The media would never dream of portraying such treatment in a favourable light. Average middle-class Americans today may not be as accepting of the intersex condition as the Indians were, but few would fail to recognise the cruelty of the way in which Williamson was treated. Williamson's parents obviously were deviants, religious kooks whose attitudes and beliefs were way out of line with the values of the system. Thus, while putting on a show of criticising modern Euro-American society, Williamson really is attacking only...
So, he didn't really point this out, but this is a common thing. This is kind of going back to that roofie case I was making earlier. But advocates, like I say, I'm going to say an oxymoron, but rebellious advocates for the system will take out these small little niche things, or things that have existed, previously, 30 years ago, and throw these before the altar of, common parlance and try to encompass them as the modern system, and blatantly ignoring how fast things have changed in the last 25 years. Like, things are radically different. Like, we're so far from where we were from before I was born. Like, so much has changed over my lifetime that we're basically fighting phantoms of the past. Or I say we, I'm not doing shit. But they are fighting phantoms of the past. They're always fighting shadows. They're never fighting a material thing. They're always fighting back, past examples of things that have already been vanquished. Anyways, let's keep on.
Deviant minorities and cultural laggards who haven't yet adapted to the dominant values of present-day America. Haviland, the author of the book, on page 12, portrays cultural anthropology as iconoclastic, as challenging the assumptions of modern Western society. This is so far contrary to the truth that it would be funny if it weren't so pathetic. The mainstream of modern American anthropology is abjectly subservient to the values and the assumptions of the system. When today's anthropologists pretend to challenge the values of their society, typically they challenge only the values of the past, obsolete and outmoded values now held by no one but deviants and laggards who have not kept up with the cultural changes that the system requires of us. Haviland's use of Williamson's article illustrates this very well, and it represents the general slant of Haviland's book. Haviland plays up ethnographic facts that teaches readers politically correct lessons, but he understates or omits altogether ethnographic facts that are politically incorrect. Thus, while he quotes Williamson's account to emphasize the Indians' acceptance of intersexed persons, he does not mention, for example, that among many of the Indian tribes, women who committed adultery had their noses cut off, whereas no such punishment was inflicted on male adulterers, or that among the Crow Indians, a warrior who was struck by a stranger had to kill the offender immediately, else he was irretrievably disgraced in the eyes of his tribe. Nor does Haviland discuss the habitual use of torture by the Indians of the eastern United States. Of course, facts of that kind represent violence, machismo, and gender discrimination. Hence, they are inconsistent with the present-day values of the system and tend to get censored out as politically incorrect. Yet I don't doubt that Haviland is perfectly sincere in his belief that anthropologists challenge the assumptions of Western society. The capacity for self-deception of our university intellectuals will easily stretch that far. To conclude, I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting that it is good to cut off noses for adultery, or that any other abuse of women should be tolerated. Nor would I want to see anybody scorned or rejected because they are intersexed, or because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, etc., etc., etc. But in our society today, these matters are, at most, issues of reform. The system's neatest trick consists in having turned these powerful rebellious impulses, which otherwise might have taken a revolutionary direction, to the service of these modest reforms.
Anyways, alrighty. That was the system's neatest trick. I'd like to thank anybody in the future who might be watching this. Maybe I'll record something else tonight when I get back from work. We'll have to see. This is also just a test for my audio, getting my system, and just me trying to get better at speaking in front of a microphone because I'm fucking terrible at it. Anyways, thank you.